This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. We're going to get into part 11 of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle from 1975. Before we do, I sometimes do little announcements for a couple of minutes before I get into the book. Sometimes. Well, I'm going to do one this time. Just saw something that irked me. Stuff that I see all the time. Just saw one again. I've done the show months ago on talking about noting all the certain movies, the plethora of movies I've seen in my life, and cartoons and news articles which emasculate men. So I've done the ministry's done its man show a few months back, but I keep seeing them, and I don't know. I'll make a note in my memory every time I see one, but I saw one again. So me and my 2.5-year-old girl were watching one of her DVDs. This one is called Robots. Pixar, a thing. Robin Williams and a bunch of other stars do the voices, but it's a Pixar thing. It's called Robots. It came out in like 2004, 2005. It's kind of entertaining, parts of it. She loves it. But I noticed during the climactic fighting scene where the good robots were going to fight the bad robots, the Robin Williams robot acted very heroic and told his sister to stay put, stay here. He told his sister, don't come around, we men robots, we're going to go do the fighting and take care of business. And he told his sister, you're the only thing I have that's good in this world. You stay here. And I thought, wow, how unusual in our culture today to find a children's movie that shows men being men and the males being heroic. You don't see that anymore. Well, they got me. I got my hopes up a little too soon because sure enough, 5 or 10 minutes later, after the fight scene starts, the good robots start getting their butts kicked, and just in the nick of time, what happens? The little sister shows up with a bunch of other robots to save the day and turn the tide in the fight scene, so the good guys won. So the little sister had to come and say, "Here we go again." It's taboo in our culture to show men being heroic because they want to brainwash males in this culture to be docile, emasculated. And boy, they've done a good job. Boy, have they ever done a good job. But sure enough, doggone, every single time. It's everywhere, folks. And if you aren't seeing it, you're blind. You're just blind. Men are just having pot shots taken at them. Just any movie that comes out, any popular magazine, any book that comes out, anything. Discovery shows, pseudo-science specials, comparing the genders. They're all hit pieces against men. Why? Again, because the oligarchs, who are males, they know the lowdown. They know that it's propaganda on all the mainstream disinformation, Satan's airwaves. And so they don't buy it. They don't read that crap, but they got us reading it. They got us common men watching it, and they got you fooled. They got you emasculated. Anyway, yeah, just saw another one, and I'll probably see another one in the next week, and so on. I don't know that it's worth compiling them again and doing another show, but I don't know. I wanted to let you know. I saw another one. Okay, let's get into part 11 of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle. Now, these are the origins of these oligarchs that I was just talking about, the money changers. Okay. Sparta, the Pelennors, wealth, and women. Sparta, of all the Greek states, is one that resisted most of all, in ancient times, the encroachments of international money power and the circulation of precious metals, and all those demoralizing factors deriving therefrom. However, from those laws promulgated by Lycurgus in Sparta, reputedly during the 9th century BC, but, as according to the archaeologists, the early 6th century BC, it would seem that all those evils deriving from giving such international money power free rein had already been experienced and had brought about that reaction amongst the people generally that enabled Lycurgus to take those measures by which he expunged forever the main causes of the sickness of greed and self-interest which ate at the heart of the Doric overlord class of the Peloponnese. To him are ascribed those laws directed towards this purpose, such as are described by Plutarch, quote, "Not contented with this redistribution of land, he resolved to make a division of their movables too, that there might be no odious distinction or inequality left among them. But finding it would be very dangerous to go about it openly, he took another course and defeated their avarice by the following stratagem. He commanded that all gold and silver coin should be called in, and that only a sort of money of iron should be current, a great weight and quantity of which was very little worth. So that to lay up 20 or 30 pounds there was required a pretty large closet, and to remove it nothing less than a yoke of oxen. With the diffusion of this money, at once a number of vices were banished from Lacedaemon, for who would rob another of such coin? Who would unjustly detain or take by force or accept as a bribe a thing which was not easy to hide or a credit to have, or indeed of any use to cut in pieces? For when it was red hot, they quenched it in vinegar, and by that means spoiled it, and made it almost incapable of being worked. In the next place, he declared an outlawry of all superfluous arts. But here he might have spared his proclamation, for they of themselves would have gone after the gold and silver, the money which remained being not so proper payment for curious work. For being iron it was scarcely potable, neither if they should take the means to export it, would it pass among other Greeks who ridiculed it. So now there was no means of purchasing foreign goods and small wares, no itinerant fortune-teller, no harlot-monger, or gold or silversmith, engraver or jeweler set foot in a country which had no money, so that luxury deprived little by little of that which fed and fomented it, wasted to nothing, and died away of itself. For the rich had no advantage here over the poor, as their wealth and abundance had no road to come abroad by, but were shut up at home doing nothing." Unquote. Plutarch, of course, lived in a city and in an age when all wealth was assessed in terms of precious metals by weight. Needless to say, in order to have the cooperation of the real ruler, local money creative power, towards the publication of his works, he wisely followed that trend which undoubtedly had been instigated in Athens of making a mockery of Spartan customs, a trend which is still followed to this day by many so-called scholars. Sparta, early in the millennium, had come to understand the real significance of precious metal money as being part of an international confidence game. Sparta also realized the destructive forces inherent in the activities of its controllers and the foreign luxury traders they encouraged and financed in order to debilitate the people, and so make absolute their own secret hegemony, such as destroyed all racial pride in that people on whom they were battening, and thus destroying their will to resist through creating obsession with pleasure. The evidence is in the findings of the British school at Athens from their excavations at the site of the city of Sparta. Quote, "The excavations of the British school at Athens at the site of the city of Sparta reveal a flourishing state of the arts and manufactures in Laconia carried on, if not wholly by Laconian workmen themselves, at least by foreign artists who were welcome and encouraged to ply their crafts without any of the dark suspicion of strangers that was so marked in latter times." Unquote. The so-called Spartan way of life derived from the necessity of the Spartans to always be prepared for total war from abroad as their... You gotta be kidding me. Is this why we're told how horrible the Spartans were? How austere the Spartans were? They stood up to the international money power, so did they get smirched in history as a result of that? Wow. Well, nothing surprising me anymore. Anyway, the so-called Spartan way of life derived from the necessity of the Spartans to always be prepared for total war from abroad as their final rejection of international money power made certain would come. Wow. Oh, and to be always prepared for war from within, i.e., insurrection, an equal certainty deriving from the same causes. Holy mackerel. This is why the Spartans are so disparaged in our history classes, isn't it? Wow. It's not the winners of wars that write the history books. It's the bankers, because the bankers are the real winners of the wars. The bankers and their Vatican bosses. The first Messenian War, 736 to 716 BC, was entered into by King Theopompus of Sparta for the usual reasons for any war in a state indicated by archaeological findings as being under the thumb of international money power, instigation by that money power in favor of its arms industry and its other long-range purposes. The long drawn-out character of the war indicated that the Messenians had equal access to international arms industry with Sparta. Armies are not raised and maintained in long drawn-out wars without finances acceptable in international trade and ready access to the best of weapons and equipment. And it is clear the Messenians were not short of such. It's another thing we're told in history, that the Spartans went on this aggressive war against the Messenians to deliberately enslave them. And I'm detecting that what David Astle's getting at is the Spartans didn't have a choice. It sounds like the Messenians were in the pay of the international bankers, and we're going to attack Sparta. Let's see. The first and second Messenian wars were followed by constitutional crises. Oh, let me back up. This war served that purpose most desirable to money power of reducing the power of kings. Quote, "The first and second Messenian wars were both followed by constitutional crises." The first settlement was a victory of the Spartan peers over the kings and a curbing of royal prerogatives and powers, unquote. Such would have been typical of the progress of international money power in its usual insidious takeover of any state or civilization. Quote, the crisis after the Second Messenian War was, at least within the ranks of the Spartans themselves, a democratic one, if that very dubious word can be used, unquote. The long drawn-out character of the Second Messenian War indicated the same underlying factor of the original war of conquest, i.e., international money power extending its favors to both sides, to the insurgents and to Sparta. The final edicts of Lycurgus, as a result of the constitutional crisis that followed the Second Messenian War, certainly indicate he was aware of the loss of sovereignty that came to any state that based its money system on the product of the international bullion brokers, and which meant dependence on their good graces, the more especially if such state had no minds of its own. The Second Messenian War, which was doubtless to have established total, quote-unquote, democracy, that is, total rule of the international banking fraternity. Oh, so that's why Bush Jr. and all the rest of them throw around that word democracy. Because according to David Astle, democracy means, let's hear this again, it means total rule of the international banking fraternity. Bingo. Okay. It failed so far as such purpose was concerned. Lycurgus's answer to a man who insisted he create a democracy in the state was, quote, first, create a democracy in your own house, unquote. Certainly an apt answer. Wow, that's a great answer. What a great answer. Yeah, let your children run the show. Let them have let your wife have equal say and in everything. Good luck with that one. Good luck. Let your children there you go, democracy. The complaint of Theognis, admirer of Sparta, a visitor from Megara, whose political aim was directed towards the prevention of the recurrence of a tyranny at Megara, should not be forgotten, and bore light on the conditions at Sparta as well, and that gave rise to Lycurgus. Quote, tradesmen reign supreme. The bad lord it over their betters. This is the lesson that all must thoroughly master, unquote. Of the reforms of Lycurgus, their cause, and those forces they were directed against, there is no doubt whatsoever, and verification through the findings of archaeology, such as the work of Dr. Blakeway in Laconia, reestablishes the time as being, as remarked above, after the Second Messenian War, namely between 600 BC and 550 BC, quote, he has demonstrated from archaeological evidence that between 600 BC and 550 BC, foreign imports into Sparta practically ceased. Corinthian pottery, which had been common in Sparta in the early or Proto-Corinthian period, is exceedingly rare after 600 BC. Ivory, amber, Egyptian scarabs, and Phoenician goods likewise cease before 550 BC, and the same is true of gold and silver jewelry, unquote. There is no doubt that early in the 6th century BC, the Spartans totally excluded the international money market, such as controlled the rest of Greece through silver and gold money. and the bankers' practices relating thereto. So that's why the Athenians in our history books are painted as being more virtuous than the Spartans, because the Athenians were in the pocket of the bankers, apparently. The Spartans also excluded foreign trade as being equally destructive of the order of life they wished to preserve. The notion created by Plutarch of that national currency of iron as being something ridiculous and requiring also an ox cart may be dismissed as part of the steady stream of propaganda, no doubt being created in Athens against everything of ancient days, particularly the customs special to Sparta. If it is true that the Pelennors were of such weight as ruled out their being passed from hand to hand, then it may reasonably be assumed that they denoted wealth in much the same manner as the stone rings of Uap and the ancient Indus Valley civilization, more in the nature of a reserve, the circulating money being the leather notes referred to by Suidas as circulating in Lacedaemon, just as the circulating money of Uap was shell strings, similar to Tekaroro of the Gilbert Islands. It may equally have been a system whose origins were lost in remote ages, perhaps bearing relationship to that system existing in Europe during the 4th century BC, when it is clear that the spondylus shell had greater significance than that ascribed to it as, quote, prestige possession, unquote, and was part of a worldwide use of shells as money. Sparta was indeed fortunate to possess considerable reserves of iron ore, the principal deposits being at the Malian Cape and the Taenarian Promontory. Thus, both for her money and for her arms, she was therefore independent and needed no assistance from abroad. The laws of Lycurgus, excluding international money and trade, directly continued the formation of that warlike spirit and racial and national pride bred in the Spartans out of the trials of the long drawn-out Messenian wars, and which brought them in as saviors at Thermopylae, and indeed of Carthage at the end of the First Punic War, 255 BC. When the army of Regulus, encamped before the city, was destroyed by Xanthippus the Spartan. The very fact that the power of the kings had been undermined by the First Messenian War, although their position as absolute leaders of the people in war still existed, became a blessing in disguise. History has shown that the point to which international money power immediately gravitates when penetrating any people living in natural order is the top, the king himself, either directly or through the priesthood. Given his sanction and connivance in respect to their schemes, then peoples whose very souls have leaned towards the king as to the Lord's anointed are easily subdued, and their minds filled with arithmetical calculations and obsession with their animal needs, instead of that great glory of a oneness with the deity, a oneness with the harmony of the universe, and their being lords of their own world with dominion over all other life. One of the first steps of such money power towards total assumption of rule has been the eradication of kings and kingly power. Even though a king might be led into connivance with the banker's schemes, through lack of understanding, he always could still awaken and discover his mistake, and realizing the sword was still in his hand, take measures to regain his prerogative. Therefore, he had to be disposed of or reduced to a paid and willing servant. In Sparta, there seems to have been another obstacle to the promoters of that phony democracy advocated by international money power, namely the Ephorati, whose existence was undoubtedly linked to that national money power of Sparta as instituted or reinstituted under the protection of Lycurgus. Of the ephors, it may be said, their main objectives were, quote, first, the maintenance of home defense and limiting of Spartan dominion to Messenia and Laconia, i.e., no imperial entanglements. Second, the fostering of a steady policy which led to intervention in the struggle at Athens with the Pisistratids and the expulsion of the family. Third, an unrelenting hostility to the pretensions of royal power in the state, unquote. Quote, the Ephorate was a profoundly democratic institution that feared and fought against tyranny both within and without the borders of Lacedaemon, unquote. Accepting the tyrant as frontman of those alien agents of international money power, the Trapezitae, in which category the Pisistratids certainly fell, then the meaning of the policies of the Ephorate becomes clear. With the limiting of Spartan dominion to Messenia and Laconia was the establishment of an area from which Spartans could derive total economic freedom sufficient to maintain themselves, and that which, above all, maintained their way of life and its source, their national monetary system. The intervention at Athens and the total opposition to the Pisistratids was obvious policy in view of the unrelenting pressure of Athenian money power as a branch of international money power against Sparta, city that had made mockery of the power of the counting houses of the world financial centers and had set up example in the world which would become inspiration to others. The hostility to kingly power by the Ephorate would be guided by what they doubtless saw was the need, if their national life was to be maintained, of making sure that kings in no way had the power to surrender themselves and the people they represented to the blandishments of international money power, whose opportunity, alas, has always been a weak and ill-instructed king. However, the remark of Archidamos, king of Sparta, at the commencement of the quote-unquote Great Peloponnesian War reveals, even at that day, 428 BC, how the corruptive forces outpouring from Babylonia, with its immediate agents, had certainly re-entered Sparta to some degree, quote, and war is not so much a matter of armaments as of the money that makes armaments effective, unquote. In his speech to his own people, Archidamos also warns them of the 6,000 talents war chest supposedly held by the Athenians in the Acropolis. Both of these statements show no understanding of that in which a king should above all be instructed, national monetary emission, and prove how right were the ephors in the controls with which they surrounded kingship. Archidamos privately was close friend of Pericles, scion of the Alcmeonidae, whose destiny, Greek history shows, to have always been closely linked to that of international money power. During the period when the national currency of Sparta maintained its integrity, it might be safe to say that the Spartan, insofar as it is possible for true freedom to exist, was a free man. You guys hear that? David Astle tells you Spartans were free. In our history book, we're told that Spartans were under a totalitarian regime, and it was the Athenians who were free. The Athenians had the democracy, quote-unquote democracy, and the Spartans had the ancient reflection of communism, or whatever it was. And David Astle says it was completely the opposite. Far out, man. Seriously. Every shred of news or information you get from a mainstream source, cut it up, throw it away, or stand it on its head if you want to have any semblance of truth out of it at all. Cut it up, throw it away, don't even listen to it. Or just flip it on its head and understand that the reverse is true if it's a mainstream news source. Oh, man. Yeah, I was talking to a guy today, a friend of mine, who doesn't get it at all, doesn't understand the world at all. And we were talking about ancient societies and their health problems they used to have. And he's made some comment, yeah, they didn't used to have the pharmaceuticals to keep them healthy. Oh, gosh. What do you tell a guy like that? I certainly don't know. And I've tried once before on a different topic, and he just shut down. Just blank stare. So I'm not going to try again. Let him find out the hard way. Okay, back to the book. So, the Spartans were free. Far out. Okay, indeed, the Helots were more than likely more free by a long way than are the laboring classes of this day. The Spartans were more free than you, buddy. You, common American, average Joe six-pack, and you're told that the Spartans were slaves to their system. You're the slave, American. And certainly more free than those classes of the semi-mass production lines of the other Greek cities, wow, whose monetary systems were almost all, whether fiduciary and of state issue or not, at the mercy of the bankers. That would include Athens, and we're told of the heroism, the freedom in Athens. It's all lies. And therefore, the manipulators of the value of bullion and slaves, wherever it was they maintained their center, generally assumed to be, you guessed it, Babylonia, and its outposts, Lydia and Naucratis in the Nile Delta, and Phoenicia, and Athens, and Cyzicus, and Colchis, and many other cities in key positions to trade with the world beyond. I'm quite confident that I'm butchering some of the pronunciations of some of these ancient cities, and I'm also quite confident that Dwight the Bright, who's I'm sure is listening, hello Dwight, I'm pretty sure you know the proper pronunciation to these words, and you're probably cringing every time I do it, right? I'm doing my best. I was educated in public school. I'm still, for the rest of my life, I'll be trying to, overcome that, compensate for that. Here we go. A monetary system, simple, inviting neither peddlers of luxury, panderers, or pornographers to make mockery of the lives of the people, issued and regulated by a benevolent state, and undoubtedly with its units paid into circulation with care and attention to the result on the national well-being and strength, bred a sturdy, independent people, completely contemptuous of the gold madness raging elsewhere. They were an example by which other great peoples came to profit, outstandingly the Romans. They lived with a feeling of great superiority to the Athenians, who, while having a plentiful currency, except during the periods of exhaustion of the Laurian silver mines, were exposed to all the evils of control over their political life by alien money power through the Trapezite. There you have it, folks. It was the Athenians who were enslaved, not the Spartans. History gives much information about the means whereby money was collected and raised and spent, but nothing as to those shadowy figures who institute its units in the first place, and, as in the case of the bankers' quote-unquote democracies, inject them into the circulation. As to when international money power re-entered Sparta, there is little enough evidence. But the outlook of King Archidamos suggested it had made quite some progress by the date of the commencement of the Peloponnesian War, and it may be safely said that to win that war, out of which could come nothing but gain to international money power, Sparta had to make almost total concession. The final victory over Athens and her empire, which ended the war, achieved the purposes of the international bullion and slave traders as surely as final defeat would so have done. As it will be remembered, the relaxation and luxury that inundated Rome after the Second Punic War, as a result of the concessions that had been made to international bullion and slave traders in order to be able to rearm after Cannae and ultimately drive Hannibal out of Italy and defeat him in his own territory, within 25 years dragged the Romans down to a debauched, money-mad mob, though still mighty through the employment at arms of the defeated peoples. Similarly, after the Peloponnesian War, like causes had done the same for Sparta. And it was but 25 years later, in 371 BC, the Spartan phalanx, softened to the core, crumbled into bloody ruin at Leuctra to Epaminondas, the Theban, and never again recovered the elan that had made it the victor of 100 battles. For the Spartans now, more than any, were consumed by the corrupting diseases of money madness and its attendant liberalism. That, by 360 BC, the ancient money system that had been the factor behind the morale of the Spartan of Thermopylae was little more than a memory, is revealed by the following quotation taken from Alexander Del Mar. Quote, "The crime of Gylippus, BC 360, and the decree offered upon its exposure vis-a-vis that no coin of gold or silver be admitted into Sparta, but that they should use the money that had formerly obtained, shows that as this decay of the state and weakening of credit went on, gold or silver coins, at or near their bullion value, gradually crept into circulation as money. The failure of the decree to pass is conclusive that the iron numerical system was no longer practicable, unquote. In other words, the damage to that which had been Sparta and its people done by the ruler who first of all turned a blind eye to dealings in the precious metals, the regrowth of international trade, and no doubt the holdings of deposits in Athenian banks, and who failed to deal with ferocity with those who interfered with the Pelennors, either by counterfeiting or speculation, was irreparable. It seemed this time the clock could not be turned back. Okay, folks, we're at the halfway point, just about, maybe a little more so. We're going to take a break. We'll come back after the break with the rest of Part 11 of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle. All right, we are back. Let's finish up with Part 11 of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle. Thus, while Sparta finally collapsed before the unremitting pressure of the Athenian, or better put, the international money market, seeming to yield its ancient strength and the sources of its independence, the Athens that carried on as well, partly for reasons as elsewhere given, was but a shadow of itself with the approach of the exhaustion of the mines, and thence the failure of the base of its money power and the quote-unquote confidence essential to its maintenance. Moreover, still in the hands of the bankers as a center of trade for trade's sake, Athens was become but a name. As with Rome, by the time of the civil wars, its original people had disappeared into that mass of freed slaves and immigrants from elsewhere, the quote-unquote sojourners, who were now a large part of the Athenian population, and for whose leaders Xenophon, the journalist, obviously fronted when he proposed that special taxes should be lifted from foreigners who at the same time were not required to do military service. Parenthesis. Here, it might be remarked that it is perhaps unfortunate that should still survive the writings of a paid propagandist, so similar to the writings of some of his brethren today, when so little remains of Greek literature relative to the total output. End parenthesis. Of Spartan money as reinstituted under the patronage of Lycurgus, Ernest Babylon, famous French numismatist of the 19th century, wrote, quote, "A long time after the use of money had been spread throughout the Hellenic world, Sparta continued, as through tradition, to make use of ingots of iron as a means of exchange. These bars were known under the description of gâteaux de passerie. Each one weighed an aeginetic mina, and to carry only 6 of them, that is to say, about 536 kilograms, a wagon drawn by 2 oxen was required. This information supplied to us by Xenophon and Plutarch agrees with that from central Italy, where cumbersome bars of bronze were carried in carts. Ice grave plaustris quidem convihentes, said Titus Vivius." all kinds of stories circulated on the subject of the famous Pelennors of Sparta that seem to have remained in use until the Persian Wars. It was said, for instance, that the iron used in the manufacture of this money was unsuitable for any other purpose, and was rendered brittle by an operation consisting of heating it until red hot, then quenching it in vinegar. In the conservative capital of Laconia, it appears that these ingots of iron were the sole money in use, and all citizens were forbidden, under penalty of death, to possess any other money. When Epaminondas died, he was so poor that nothing was found in his house in the way of wealth other than an old iron. At Thebes, the native land of Epaminondas, where money was known and struck at an early date, found in the residence of the hero, could have no more than a superstitious character, unquote. This surprises us less, especially as, since the 7th century, Phaedon, king of Argos, when he struck the first silver money of Aegina and introduced a standard system of weights and measures into the Peloponnese, withdrew the former iron spits from circulation that had served as money until then, and consecrated a certain number of samples, quote-unquote, in ex voto, in the sanctuary of Hera at Argos. At the time of Aristotle, they could still be seen in the temple. Babylon, most learned scholar as he was, this is Ernest Babylon, however, reflects the complacent attitude of the bankers at the end of the last century, which was founded on the idea, such had been their luck during the previous century, that their millennium had finally come. With him, money was precious metal, and precious metal was money. Although of interest, his information, a repetition of Xenophon, the journalist, and Plutarch, offers not much more light. Though over 2,000 years had gone by, precious metal money and its promoters still ruled, despite a dozen great kingdoms and empires having risen at its behest and having fallen at its behest. Did Babylon see the shadow which lurked behind the throne? He closed his eyes and turned his head away. Lycurgus was without doubt inspired to re-establish this national monetary system by the clear understanding he must have come to have of the evil effects of this gold and silver madness, and its disastrous effects as a result of the operations of the trapezitae, or bankers, relative to the destruction of national morale and being. Precious metal coinage was currency whose total circulation the state could in no way control, because of the desirability of its material internationally. In the common money market of the silver bullion brokers, it was material which, whether minted into money by state authority or otherwise, produced a money always of value regardless of local convention. Its value was dictated by the arbitrary decision of that international fraternity who controlled its mining, and the slaves that mined it, and out of manipulation of that pyramid of abstract money they created thereon, controlled the political affairs of states. The money that had been established in Sparta was of value to Spartans alone. Although no record exists of such matter, it may be safely assumed that the Pellinors and the leather multiples or divisibles of suidas entered the circulation as against state indebtedness, thus reducing taxation, that vicious destroyer of peoples, to relatively negligible amounts. Their pitted and otherwise worthless appearance, deriving from their being immersed in vinegar when red hot, made them of no value for any other purpose than that for which they were intended. The use of this national money was the force that gave Sparta the leadership of Hellas until the end of the Peloponnesian War, even if decline had commenced with the execution of the great general Pausanias by the Ephors in 479 BC, and was that which necessarily dictated the policy of the extirpation of the tyrannies, the tyrant always being representative for the agent of international money creative power through precious metal control. There might be temptation to assume the Pellinors were a system of quote-unquote iron greenbacks. But while they resembled the quote-unquote greenbacks in this, that they were the total will to be of the Spartans, assuming the truth of their great weight, as pointed out above, they may have been more in the character of that monetary system of very ancient days, of which the stone rings of Uap are a last remaining evincement. A healthy, wholesome people who controlled totally their state and existence would have little reason to accumulate money fortunes and wealth as distinct from the land which was their patrimony. And as such, money fortunes begin and end as little more than figures in the banker's ledger, nor could they be guided into becoming mouthpieces for the policies of the bankers. Meals were eaten in common amongst men, as in Carthage of earlier days, and a genuine contempt for luxury existed. A simple life was not sought after so much as it came of its own accord, as a natural outcome of such monetary system created for their better and right living, and which preserved them from the encroachments of that liberalizing, demoralizing, and debt-creating force of international trade, and its destructive effect on the esprit de corps of any particular race or people who are foolish enough to permit its proponents to have their way. Although it was said of the early days of the laws of Lycurgus and his monetary reforms that precious metals seized in war were deposited with the Arcadians, of later days Augustus Beck wrote of gold and silver in Sparta, quote, Sparta, during a period of several generations, swallowed up large quantities of the precious metals, as in Aesop's fables, the footsteps of the animals which went in were to be seen, but never of those which came out. The principal cause of this stagnation was that the state kept the gold and silver in store, and only reissued them for war and foreign enterprise, although there were instances of individuals who amassed treasures according to the law, unquote. Xenophon stated that Lycurgus made the privilege of citizenship equally available to all who observed what was enjoined by laws, without taking any account of weakness of body or scantiness of means, which would mean that no Spartan suffered in respect to the mess or cessation to which he was entitled to belong on account of economic condition. Xenophon had lived in Sparta and was writing before the loss of Messenia. Aristotle, who declared failure to pay dues entailed political disenfranchisement, wrote after the loss of Messenia in 370 BC, and the certain penetration by the bankers of the Piraeus and the assumption of control of Spartan fiscal affairs, which it may be safely said they were already conceded by an already corrupted Sparta, ready to accept any humiliation to save itself from total ruin. The final military collapse at Leuctra rose from that weakened condition that followed the apparent victory of the quote-unquote great Peloponnesian War and those concessions that already would have been made to the international bankers, now in the Persian court, as a result of the desperate need of the Spartans for ships. The loan of 5,000 talents towards the building of ships, which was granted to Sparta by Persia as a result of the Treaty of Miletus, 412 BC, would not have been granted without major concessions being exacted, most likely abrogation of those Spartan edicts forbidding the sojourn of foreign traders, etc., on Spartan territory. It would not take long, once such traders had been admitted, for them to undermine the morale of that which had been Sparta by spreading the money madness and the promotion of luxury and the creation of unnatural concern with sex and body needs. You guys hear that? According to David Astle, when a society runs rampant with promiscuity and obsession with sex, David Astle tells you that it's the bankers, the money traders, that are responsible for so doing that to your society. That's fascinating. Well, after all, Jesus said, the love of money, the root of all evil. Not just some, but all. Back to the book. Of this situation, Polybius, as quoted by Humphrey Mitchell, wrote the following, quote, "As long as they aspired to rule over their neighbors or over the Peloponnesians alone, they found the supplies and resources furnished by Laconia itself adequate, as they had all they required ready to hand, and quickly returned home, whether by land or by sea. But once they began to undertake naval expeditions, and to make military campaigns outside the Peloponnese, it was evident that neither their iron currency nor the exchange of their crops for commodities which they lacked, as permitted by the laws of Lycurgus, would suffice for their needs. These enterprises demanded a currency in universal circulation and supplies drawn from abroad, and so they were compelled to beg from the Persians, to impose tribute on the islanders, and exact taxes from all the Greeks. For they recognized that under the legislation of Lycurgus it was impossible to aspire, I will not say to supremacy in Greece, but to any position of influence," unquote. The fact is, however, Sparta, while following the laws of Lycurgus, had dominated Greece in more or less degree. As soon as she lost sight of the meaning and purpose of such laws, She became just another petty state, an agency for the subterranean control by international banking through manipulation of the silver and gold bullion basis of her currency. Each man, concerned with his own need and greed, aimlessly following the pretty bubble which was the illusion of the banker's quote-unquote wealth. The old order, and that which had given them strength and national morale, was soon destroyed through the promotion of foreigners and the lower castes, and the helots, who merely took the name but not the meaning. Also by the stirring up of women, here we go, by the stirring up of women towards rejection of their subordinate place in life, just as in America. And in the Christian biblical position in life, it's not really subordinate. And therefore instituting insidious attack on the natural order of the home. There it is. That's what they've done in America, and that's what they've done to the women. That's what they did to the women in Greece, and they've done it now to the women in America. Out of which is bred the natural order of life itself, the order of the home. Wow. History repeats. The money changers use the same tactics over and over. The later age of Aristotle, with its hard and realistic facts, as referred to by some writers, was no more realistic than the earlier age of Xenophon. Rather, it was less so. It was the age of the triumph of those international interests whose arming and instigation of the Messenian helots in an earlier age had decided Spartans to accept that structure of law as advocated by Lycurgus, which meant surrender of so much ease of living, rather than become the same as most other Greek states, an alien money manipulator's paradise, with, as Theognis of Megara put it, quote, tradesmen reigning supreme, and the bad lording it over their betters, unquote. As the earliest finds of the clay facsimiles of precious metal coinage at Athens seem to date around the middle of the 5th century B.C., it may be assumed that one way or the other, either through Spartans permitted to reside at Athens, or through those Spartan mercenaries who traveled the world seeking employment for their skill at arms, the lust for having one man more than his neighbor slowly became injected into them. Perhaps Spartan mercenaries, who always required to be paid in those international currencies of silver and gold, returning from abroad via Athens, had been inveigled into depositing their pay in such gold or silver with the bankers of the Piraeus, with whom it might, quote-unquote, grow from interest, taking home the baked clay coins as evidence of their account, and thus evading contravention of the Spartan laws in respect to possession of gold and silver. With the resumption of the rule of international money power in later Spartan history, one of the most outstanding instances of that sickness rotting the fibers of their racial morale was the tale of those homoioi who seemed to have fallen in the social scale and were no longer able to take their places in those great messes, the Sicilianus, the breeding places of that esprit de corps that was Sparta. Scholars give various reasons for these quote-unquote disenfranchised Spartans, apparently known as the Hypomeanists. The reason for their coming to be is, however, more than clear. They are the direct result of the power to discriminate, which is the natural outcome in favor of the banker, and that actual God power he exercises once installed as local money creator. More than likely, after the Peloponnesian War, and certainly after the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, the re-established bankers, following usual policy, would have taken care that certain families, who this caste of men instinctively realized might yet create opposition to them, were dispossessed by one means or another. With that banker-created money as being now the necessary qualification for membership to the Sicytiones, it was a small matter to make sure that such persons whose disenfranchisement they planned never had enough. Clearly, in such later day, the Sicytion or mess charges being assessed in silver money, whose issue the bankers controlled, those to whom such alien bankers extended no favors, and therefore ultimately dispossessed through mortgage and foreclosure, not having any longer the wherewithal to pay, no longer belonged. Further, seeing their former helots raised up to a place of honor and riches by bankers' created wealth, and certainly by the reign of King Cleomenes III, 228 to 219 BC, actually sitting in their place in the Sicytion, little desire to retrieve such a distinctly lost cause remained. The Spartan, whether poor or whether rich in land, in the days of the national currency, had been the social equal of any other Spartan. However, as much as anything, the slow decay of the Spartan principle derived from a most outstanding omission in the Constitution, which was total lack of provision for the redistribution of wealth at certain definite intervals, and the cancellation of debt, as in the Hebrew custom of the 49th year. Yeah, the Jubilee year. Right on. We need that. Boy, do we ever need that in America. Needless to say, even in the days of the national currency, there must have been tendency towards economic inequality resulting from such omission. But the rapid increase of such economic inequality after the return of the bankers that certainly followed the quote-unquote Great Peloponnesian War, additional to furthering the breakup of the caste system that previously had obtained in Sparta in some degree, and wherein each man had known his place in the order of society, also caused a further breakup in the natural order of life of Spartan man as master of home and family. You could say the same thing about the emasculated, indebted, beleaguered American man. Now, in that Spartan society wherein women had always known considerable freedom relative, say, to their Athenian sisters, the control of wealth, by the way, that's the opposite of what we get in our mainstream history books again. David Astle claims that women had considerable freedom, especially relative to their to the women in Athens. We get the complete opposite story in mainstream history books. Women were subjugated, they were enslaved. Okay, right. And, well, that's propaganda for you. That's the mainstream devil's disinformation grid. Back to the book. In that Spartan society wherein women had always freedom compared to Athens, the control of wealth, however designated, passed substantially into the hands of women. You hear that? Women in Sparta had money, they had rights, they had property. This is far out. Concern for the growth of quote-unquote money, no doubt, just as in this day, replaced care for their men and concern for themselves as mothers of the race and concern for the growth of their children. Yeah, so when money becomes more important, even women lose the concern for their husbands and even the concern for their children. Okay. Quote, 2/5 of the land and wealth had come into their hands, simply because lack of men left them heiresses, and this wealth they used extravagantly, maintaining racehorses which they exhibited at the Olympic Games, costly equipages and fine clothes. They meddled in the affairs of state and brought undue influence upon the conduct of the government, unquote. Further proof that women were not intended by our Lord to be involved in government. In such society, this stratum of wealthy women have no respect for men as such. Too often. Can you say, hello, modern America? Modern American woman. While perhaps not classified as heterae, who all said and done had served some useful purpose to men, they clearly lived public lives very much the same as the heterae. Here we go. Last paragraph for this installment, and looks like he's going to be describing American women, although it's Spartan women he's referring to. Such women, their heads full of figures and pride, would have served most usefully those alien money powers who ever have... I got to pause here again. If you've ever seen that movie, From Freedom to Fascism, and the maker of the movie, whatever, I forget the guy's name, but anyway, he was quoting from a acquaintance of his who was a member of the Rockefeller clan, and this member of the Rockefeller clan told him, hey, the American public, we sold them a bill of goods. We told them that feminism was about women's rights, and he laughed and said, that wasn't it at all. Feminism, getting women out in the workplace, competing with men, all that was about was profits. It was about being able to tax the other 50% of the population. And now David Astle writes that it worked the same in Sparta. That when women got their heads full of figures and pride and got involved in the government and had no respect for their husbands and a diminished concern for their families, their own children, he said, in Sparta, these women served most usefully those alien money powers, same as the American women today, whoever have sought to further their purposes through corrupt and malleable persons. Women rarely corrupt in the sense that a man may be corrupt because of their natural need to shelter behind what seems to be strength, as arrogant money power would appear to them, are malleable. David Astle's telling you, women, and that's true. I've seen it myself, and I've talked to people who would agree with me. I know I've had conversations. Women, they naturally have this need for security, and that's why women marry up, that old saying. They have this built-in need for security. Women do. Men don't have that. They have other things. And so, but that does make women more malleable to alien money powers, to the money changers. Their own Spartan men, either dead, and if not dead, completely confused with the new liberalization program. Just as in America today, American men are completely confused and hooked on porn and emasculated by all the pop culture movies they're watching. Completely confused are the men with the new liberalization program of the returned bankers. The Spartan men were virtually enslaved, just like American men today. Therefore, the Spartan women turned for the protection they needed to what seemed to be the new strength, pudgy and gross though it may have been. But man, does that ever describe American women today? It describes the whole situation of American men today, too. This is eerie, just uncanny. Anyway, folks, that was part 11 of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle from 1975. Good luck finding this one again in your local mainstream bookstore. I mean, hard enough finding it online. It's downloadable online, but boy, in hardcover, actual binding, I don't know that you can find this anymore. Maybe, but it wouldn't be easy. You're not supposed to know this stuff. You're not supposed to read books like this, which is why I'm reading it to you, all 4 or 5 of you out there who are listening to this. Anyway, I'm Gordon Comstock. This has been the Ministry of Truth. Over and out.